Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ash here coming at you today in Clash Royale. Today, we're going to talk Clan Wars, baby, but we're specifically going to talk about Collection Day, where you have 3 attacks. We're going to go over 3 different game modes. I'm going to give you 5 of my best tips for each of the 3 game modes, starting with Draft, then Double Elixir, and then Sudden Death. I'm not much of a 2v2 guy personally, however, I will do a follow-up 2v2 video if you guys want it, so let me know in the comments below. So starting out with Draft mode, by far my very favorite mode inside the entire game. I love Draft. I would play Draft 24/7 if they had a permanent Draft challenge. However, they don't, but it's my go-to on Collection Day. So let's get into my 5 tips for Draft challenge. Tip number 1 is going to be play passively at first, both on defense and on offense. So not only are you not going to rush your opponent with a random giant balloon at the bridge, but you're also going to make sure you're playing passively on defense. What does that mean? It means 2 things. Number 1 is if your opponent drops a giant in the back, you can react with, say, a knight in the back or something cycling in the same lane in the back, but you don't want to use your air targeting counters, because what if your opponent pushes you? What if you use a musketeer to counter that giant? Well, your opponent could easily push you with a balloon in the opposite lane, and you use your air targeting counter. That's why going ground really early on in response to ground is always a good idea. You don't want to burn your air counters right off the bat. Furthermore, if they're going to pressure you with a giant and a dark prince, for example, you want to make sure that you're not over defending. So they've spent 9 elixir, which is a lot, but you don't really want to spend more than 8 or 9 elixir on defense, because remember, you do have your princess tower helping you out as well. If you over defend, you leave yourself susceptible to, again, a counter lane push. That's really important to play passively at the beginning of draft challenges. Number 2 is not all win conditions are created equal. At least to me, my preference is not to draft Lava Hound unless I already have Balloon, perfect case scenario, even Graveyard. I don't really want to draft, because those are win conditions to me, which you really have to make a, you have to craft a deck around those win conditions. You have to be able to bait out the poison in the case of the Graveyard. You have to be able to have that tank, and you just need too many moving pieces that will supplement those individual win conditions, whereas a nice basic win condition like a Giant or a Hog, well, almost every support card fits well in those archetypes. So I would go with the more basic win conditions rather than a more extravagant trying to piece together a Lava Loon deck when you don't have a balloon or you don't have a miner. Number 3 is identify your opponent's weaknesses and be ready to exploit. So if you have a balloon and they only have 1 air counter, be ready to pressure them when they don't have that air counter in hand. If they have no big spell, be ready to spam when you have an elixir advantage, all your cards in 1 lane, knowing you can probably take the tower if they don't have a great splash or big spell option in their deck. Always important to draft a big spell if you can grab one in the draft. Number 4 is draft counters to the cards that you pass. In other words, you have 2 options. You can supplement the cards that you've already drafted from a more offensive point of view when you're drafting, or you can just draft counters to the cards that you're passing to your opponent. I always prefer going more defensively, so I'll draft counters. I'll take that log because I passed the princess. If I pass the archers, I will take that fireball. You know, just getting a good counter to the cards you pass, to me, sets you up for success a little bit more than if you just keep drafting cards that you like. And tip number 5 is trap your opponent with the worst counters to your win condition. So secondary to drafting cards that counter the cards that you passed, I think a good strategy is just giving your opponents really weak cards to your win condition. Let's say that you did draft a Graveyard, even though we said not to. Well, you're always going to pass the Musketeer in favor of the Dark Goblin, for example, because Dark Goblin is a much better counter to Graveyard than Musketeer is. So you always want to give your opponent the worst possible counters to your win condition. So pass that Fireball instead of the arrows if you have Goblin Barrel, for example. Double Elixir challenge. So Double Elixir, you can't go to, at least my opinion here, right? You can't go too crazy on the super heavy decks. I still prefer and advocate you guys stay in the range of 4 to 5 Elixir on your average deck cost. And you never really want to play Elixir Collector. You don't need it because it's Double Elixir time. Of course, you can still manufacture a couple extra Elixir for yourself. I'd rather add a big spell to the deck where that Elixir Collector was in 3 Musketeers or a Golem deck, for for example. Number 2 is include as much splash damage as possible. This is really important in 2v2, in Double Elixir decks, guys, because more Elixir in the Double Elixir challenge means there's going to be more troops on the board. More troops on the board gives you more opportunity to punish them with splash damage troops. Adding in a Baby Dragon and a Dark Prince, even with NATO, will do a lot of damage in Double Elixir challenge. Tip number 3 is don't leak too much Elixir. Easy to say, hard to do. But remember, for every 1 Elixir that you leak, your opponent is gaining Double Elixir speed. So don't sit there and allow your opponent to get 2 Elixir, 4 Elixir, 8, you just don't let that happen. Try not to leak Elixir. Try to cycle in the back if you have to, but do not leak a ton of Elixir. And again, that's really hard to do in the Double Elixir challenge, but always remain aware of it. Tip number 4 is just because it's Double Elixir doesn't mean you have to play aggressively, right? So let the game come to you, pace yourself, learn your opponent's deck before you start getting aggressive offensively. You can still play defensively in Double Elixir Challenge while you're trying to get all that information that you need to be able to execute a big monster push later on in the match. And tip number 5 is, since crowns do kind of matter in Clan Wars, you want to get those crowns, get more clan trophies. I prefer the Golem deck. I prefer Golem with a big spell, not Elixir Collector. Golem Night Witch right now is really, really strong. I am totally cool in Double Elixir mode to absolutely sacrificing a tower, getting into a base race situation where I know I have the heavier and the better and more powerful deck. So I like going with a 4 to 5 Elixir cost Golem deck with no Elixir Collector. To me, that's the best deck, in my opinion, for Double Elixir Challenge. Okay, let's talk about Sudden Death, the third and final game mode that we'll be discussing today. And this is my least favorite of the 3, but it's still a fun game mode. Now, number 1 is remember that it is Double Elixir time, of course. I mean, that's not my number 1 tip, but, keep that in mind here. So it's a fast pace going right into Sudden Death. Now, don't gamble. Do not spam your E-Barbs and your Rage and your Fire Spirits at the bridge as your opening play. Sure, that will work in some situations, but more often than not, it's going to provide a monster counter push for your opponent, and you'll lose the match on the second push rather than win on that first kind of haphazard push that you executed. Number 2 is focus on decks that are strong on defense. People think that, it's Sudden Death, it's Double Elixir, I should run a big fat Golem deck or a big Lava Hound beatdown deck. Actually, cycle decks and chip decks actually perform better in Sudden Death. So think about going with a mid-cost or low-cost deck versus a big heavy beatdown deck where you're using your tower as one of your resources. Now, in Sudden Death, you don't want a lot of tower damage. You cannot sacrifice a tower like we just talked about in Double Elixir time. So big decks, big beatdown decks, not the best fit, in my opinion, for Sudden Death Challenge. Number 3, stick with decks that you're good at. You're already familiar how to play your favorite decks in Double Elixir time or in Sudden Death situations, so go with those decks. You don't have to make any crazy changes. You don't have to add those Balloon Rage combos to Sudden Death just because it's Sudden Death. Stick with a deck that you are already comfortable with in Sudden Death. You already know how to play it under these circumstances, and just, keep an extra eye on your tower's health. Tip number 4 is always keep your most important counter in hand for when you really need it. You cannot afford to log that princess and then get hit with the Knight Goblin Barrel when you don't have a good answer. You can't afford your opponent to burn a fireball on a minion horde and then your opponent punishes you with 3 Musketeers same lane. You have to really, really, in Sudden Death, make sure that you're holding your best counter card for every time your opponent plays their number 1 win condition, Goblin Barrel, 3 Musketeers, for example. If you're going against a big Golem deck, you don't want to play a predictive Inferno Tower or an Inferno Dragon opposite lane. You got to be very careful about that stuff. Make sure that you're holding on to your best counter at all times. And number 5 is micro exchanges inside the match for positive Elixir trades are really the key to success, especially with a low cost and a mid cost deck in Sudden Elixir Challenge. So that means, using the Ice Golem Bats on that Prince to get +2 Elixir, and then just keep adding up those positive Elixir trades on defense using your tower damage as a resource, and then eventually you'll be able to cash in while you chip away in the mid game. You'll eventually be able to chip away to death or cash in on a big monster push, leading again to the death of your princess's tower and the victory in your hands. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, quickly kind of giving 15 tips for each of the game modes, or 5 tips for each of the game modes, 15 in total. Come on, Ash, you're bad with math. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Huge shout out to Bren Chong, my YouTube partner. Check out my information, my stats on Stats Royale, all in the description below. Guys, thanks so much for watching, and as always, take care, guys.